Hello everyone, welcome back to Rare Japanese Sound. And today we have a new episode that's going to be mostly me rambling for 15 to 20 minutes on a very arbitrary topic. And the one I chose for today is one that I think most of you will be familiar with, because it's going to be the whole topic of limited editions and, in a more general form, artificial scarcity. So the way we're going to structure the video today is going to be first give a sort of history of limited editions, why they didn't exist or almost didn't back in the day, why they do now. I'm then going to take a positive stance with regards to limited editions, why they may be good in today's environment for buying music. But then I'm going to go the opposite way and tell you why I think they can be dangerous in some way, why they can give a false sense of security when buying something. And finally, I'm going to give a few pieces of advice on how you should behave when looking at buying records or any sort of medium. This isn't just limited to music, so that would be helpful for anything you buy and in regards to things that are artificially made scarce. So first, what's artificial scarcity? Because I keep repeating that word. But basically that means whenever the supply of an item is limited, not by the means of production, not by how quickly you can get it through the supply chain of logistics, but when the supply is limited by a decisional factor, when in the case of records, when either the artist, the label, anything decides on a clear-cut limit for how many units should be made or for how long. So artificial scarcity can sometimes be on a time factor, but the one we have come to be most familiar with is limited supply in terms of number of records produced. But why do we have such an extreme amount of music being produced under limited editions when it wasn't the case back in the day? Well, to answer that question, you have to go back to 30 years ago at least, when the main way for people to consume music in general was two ways. One, listening to the radio, and radio was sort of the way for people to go from listening one certain single from a new album getting released to actually buying the album, and that was the general flow of how music was marketed, then bought, and rinse and repeat. So what you can get from that is people just bought the music. They didn't have any other way to consistently listen to any sort of music, unless you start to count people, taping music, but that's a whole different story. In today's world, people are consuming music very differently. When someone tells you that they listen to an album, in 99% of cases, they will mean that they listen to the album on a streaming service, as opposed to listening to a physical copy of the album. And by streaming service, I mean YouTube, Spotify, or even an MP3 file on their computer. The big difference is that people don't own physical copies of their albums anymore. Best case scenario, they will own a digital copy or even some kind of DRM on their album, which means they have the right to listen to the album but don't own a copy, whether it be digitally or physically. And that makes a big difference for all labels and everyone in the music industry. How do you make money out of your albums? How do you convince people to buy albums in a world that doesn't need them anymore? And so that's how the music industry has understood that people had a certain appeal for physical formats of music, which, by the mere fact that they are physical, that has a huge premium over just buying the music or having a Spotify subscription where you can listen to all the music you want. And so linking the physical object, the physical record, to the idea of scarcity, rarity, that has been a good combination to convince people that they should buy the album. And you can't deny that it was a good strategy, because now as soon as you hear, especially in certain subgenres of music, I'm thinking particularly of one vaporwave, in a certain measure video game music, those are subgenres which have very limited audiences and because those audiences are generally very dedicated to what they buy. They very much enjoy the idea of having limited releases. It gives them more engagement toward that particular release because you add in the difficulty of getting your hands on it. Whereas if the album just has an unlimited release, you don't get the difficult factor. And in today's world, which is very driven by collectability in a lot of things, that's what this channel is about, after all, collecting music, but not only music, of course. Well, adding the difficulty factor makes people talk about the album more, they will be more engaged, they will try more actively to buy it, and they might even try to buy several copies to sell them later. But flippers, that's what we call people who buy any type of physical object with an artificial scarcity to resell it for a higher price. But even if you don't take into account people buying just for the purpose of reselling, you have people who are much more, yes, in general, much more attached to the album than if they had bought it, you know, with a normal release. And that is why we say that limited editions in general create FOMO, or fear of missing out. But you might realize that having a limited release also limits the profits that the label can make. So it's really some kind of equilibrium, a balance that has to be found by the music industry between how many copies can you make to maximize profit, but also maximize the happiness of people buying the music. You can look at it this way. On one hand, imagine that a label is creating an album on such a limited release that it only has 10 copies made available. First, it's not really a meaningful supply. And furthermore, it will make your audience angry because most people will not be able to get their hands on the album. So it creates really a bad dynamic around the album. So you want to avoid that kind of too much restriction on the supply. On the other hand, if you make a limited, quote-unquote, supply that is way too large compared to how many copies people would have bought, if you misunderstand the size of your audience, you will end up with something that is not limited anymore because you have more units than people will buy naturally. So you might understand that the purpose of a limited release is to have a number that strikes the perfect balance so that your audience will be able to buy the release, but not too easily. And you can see that some labels are even playing around with that idea by mixing up and the limited release idea and making different limited releases with different rarities. And that's why we end up today with crazy things like only 15 copies sold on a certain type of wax, but 150 on a different type of wax and 500 on a third type of wax. Really, when you start not understanding anymore what type of wax is being used for which release, you start to get a problem. But we're getting a bit astray from the original point. But hopefully now you have a better idea of the different factors involved with making a limited release. So why would artificial scarcity be a good thing at all? Well, if you've listened to what we said previously, you might understand that now people's behavior has changed with regards to buying music. Back in the day, people would just buy an album, and that's why this lack of really thinking when buying an album, they didn't think of the intrinsic value of what they were buying. And that's how you end up today with most records being worth zero, really. They are not even worth the cost that it takes to store them. That's because people just didn't think about, yeah, if I spend $20, I don't know how much records were back in the day, but let's say $20 you pay on that record. But because records generally have peak interest at release, you are guaranteed, almost in 100% of cases, to have a value down the line that will be lower than what you paid for it. And if people cared about that back in the day, you would have much lower sales. Now people are much more concerned about what they're buying, and they really enjoy to think that their album will have some kind of intrinsic value that will be retained over time. And the way that is achieved is through limited releases. So it's good for the buyer. It gives them more confidence in their product, because nobody wants to buy an album only to see the supply, you know, go through the roof and it not being worth anything. It's not a good experience, and I think labels have understood that now. Of course, it's all the more true for labels or genres of music with small audiences. That's why you see it so much in the genres we talked about earlier. But still, I guess as long as people buy the albums, it gives more room for maneuver in terms of creativity around the release, because you make, you know, small limited editions. It also gives you more range of things you can publish, because if you had to do, you know, unlimited printings, unlimited presses, it would cost you more money. Whereas when you know in advance how many you're going to make, it allows you to do some cheaper things and things that would probably have less interest. So as you've understood, having artificial scarcity decreases risk in general. But now imagine that you create your limited release for whatever album, limited to 500 copies, and they sell out instantly. So what do? Do you say, well, that's too bad, there are only 500 copies, we ain't gonna make more? If you do that, it becomes a bad experience for everyone who hasn't had the opportunity to buy them because they might have been 5 minutes late to the sale. What do you do about those people who genuinely want the album? Well, if you've been buying Vaporwave or those type of records, you know that what generally happens is they make a new limited edition on just a different type of wax. And now you might start seeing the problem behind the idea of artificial scarcity is if you've undershot the predicted demand for your album, you end up with too many copies on the market and your limited edition isn't limited anymore, because what's limited is the demand, not the supply. On the other hand, if you've overshot your prediction for what the demand would be like, then you end up in a situation where all your copies are sold out and people are angry. So in both extremes, you have angry people, and you can't expect to all the time get it right. So what labels will just naturally do is always undershoot the number of available copies. On one hand, it makes the release more desirable because people will be even more trying to buy it. They have to try even harder to get it before everyone else. So more FOMO, more traction for the release, it's all good. But then you have to make additional releases for the people who didn't get the opportunity to buy it. So you end up in that vicious circle of having to always make limited releases with always some kind of different appeal, because if you make the exact same as something you made before, people again are going to be angry. What happened to their limited edition if you make the repress exactly similar to the one you already had? And that's why you end up with first limited release with a small number on certain color of wax, and then months later they make a new one on different type of wax, and so on and so forth. So you can see that artificial scarcity is not a reliable way to make sure that your album is going to have good success and that people are generally going to get what they paid for. And in the end, nobody's really happy among buyers. Whereas if you had just a normal release, you wouldn't have that issue. But of course, in today's world, it becomes difficult to say a record without saying it's limited in some way. And by now you must be wondering, so why do I have this copy of Flora by Hiroshi Yoshimura by my side today? Is it related in any way to the topic we're covering? Well, yes and no. You see, Flora is one of the rarest CDs by Hiroshi Yoshimura, even though it's only not even 15 years old. Was it some kind of released special limited edition, you know, whatever you want? No, it wasn't limited in any way. The only limit was how many people bought it. And that's what ultimately drives the price for all releases that are older than 10 years old. All those releases had a common point. They weren't limited by the supply. The labels were just trying to sell as many as they could, but just they were limited by demand. They could only make so many that they could expect to sell, and nobody wants to, you know, press 1,000 additional copies or 10,000, 100,000 and not be able to sell them. So they kept tight supply, and because demand was low for obscure things like Yoshimura back in 2006. He had died 3 years prior, but nobody knew about him. Nobody really knew about Yoshimura until something like 2012, and then it grew exponentially until 2017, and it's still growing today. What you need to understand is real scarcity, real price, real value is a result of organic evolution of things. And the best definition of organic you can find is those albums, those records, anything that is over $100 today is because it was really niche in 1980, 1970, but now has become more mainstream. And even though city pop doesn't have, you know, such a wide popularity that everyone knows about it, it's something that is pretty obscure still, even though it starts to be pretty well known among, you know, the general YouTube culture. But still, with only a certain subset of the population wanting to get those albums, and of course they could buy the reissues in many cases. Now I would say almost half of the very popular city pop Japanese albums have been reissued in some way or form. But despite that, the originals stay expensive because they had this organic aspect to them. First, the original release, and then the fact that people who bought the albums were generally interested, and they didn't buy it with the intent of reselling them 30 years later for any reason. My point is, good things aren't limited artificially. Of course, artificial scarcity is a great opportunity for you to make money quick, but what about 10 years from now, 20 years from now? No, it's not going to happen. If those albums are going to be expensive in 20 years, it will be because there will be organic demand in 20 years that surpasses demand that you have now. Of course, you have certain exceptions. For instance, the first release of Floral Shop on cassette tape is something maybe what was limited to 100 cassettes. I don't know much about Vaporwave, but I know that that cassette is selling for upwards of, let's say, $700. In that case, of course, you have something that was extremely famous and was given an artificially scarce release. But if Floral Shop had been released in the 80s, they would have made as many as they could. And honestly, of course, this channel isn't about Vaporwave, so I'm getting way out of you know, the beaten path here for my you know, my comfort zone. But honestly, doesn't it go a bit against the point of Vaporwave to make limited editions and, you know, scarce supply on purpose? Shouldn't Vaporwave be about, you know, consumption and making as many as you can? Of course, I'm just rambling at this point, and I hope that as a buyer of albums, not only city pop, but any type of medium, and I know that many people who collect records also collect different type of things, might be playing cards, might be board games, might be video games. If you collect any of those, always be careful about anything whose supply is restricted on purpose. So really, that's all I have to say for today. And if you had to remember just one thing about what we discussed today, it would be that never forget that something that is artificially scarce but still has more demand can still be reissued, and it will, just to satisfy the demand. You don't want people not to be able to listen to the album they enjoy. On the other hand, something that just doesn't sell because people aren't interested, at least at the current time, well, you're never going to see a reissue until people are interested in it again. So that's one thing to keep in mind, and that's the whole reason why this album is so popular, because no release, because people have only been interested in it for 3 years. Okay, that was all. Hope you enjoyed the content, hope you still enjoy this format of discussion. I know by that point, 20 minutes into the video, nobody's watching anymore. But if you do, leave a comment about your impressions, other topics of discussion you like to see, and that was Rare Japanese Sounds, and until next time, stay tuned.